Disaster in Japan. Dramatic rescues and utter devastation. Tonight, after natural disaster, a power plant explosion and the threat of nuclear disaster. Just how dangerous is it? Plus, a new look at the power and fury of a tsunami.
Disaster in Japan. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, reporting tonight from Tokyo.
Good evening, everyone. Right about now, people here in Japan are starting to ask themselves, how much worse can it get? Struck yesterday by one of the largest earthquakes ever on record. Entire communities swept away under a 30-foot-high tsunami, and now this. Thousands forced to flee from the path of a radioactive leak. It's Sunday morning here in Tokyo, which, though far from the epicenter, is still feeling the occasional aftershock. In the disaster zone itself along Japan's northeast coast, rescue efforts complicated by damage to a nuclear power plant that's been venting radioactive mist and could potentially suffer a nuclear meltdown. There's also late word of an emergency involving a second reactor in that complex. Meantime, hundreds of bodies have been spotted along the tsunami-ravaged coast. It's estimated the death toll from the quake and tsunami could reach up to 1,800. Local news agencies report that in one community alone, 9,500 people are unaccounted for as thousands remain cut off by floodwaters across a broad region. We've got a lot to report here tonight. We want to start with NBC's Lee Cowan, who has the very latest.
The first lifelines are finally being lowered into a sea of mud and despair. And while the rescue efforts are heroic, they're dwarfed by the sheer scale of Japan's disaster. There are so many to help, but nowhere near the hands to offer it. A grim equation that's forcing those lucky enough to survive into a terrible limbo. Hundreds are lining up for what little food and water is available. And at shelters still sturdy enough to house the living, survivors pour over an ever-growing list of the dead.
I still have people who I haven't been able to contact, and there have been reports of the nuclear leak. I'm really concerned about their safety.
Add to it all, a nuclear accident. An explosion shortly after the quake at this power plant damaged a building housing a reactor, causing a radioactive leak and the evacuation of a 12-mile radius. The Japanese officials say the leaks are decreasing and that the risk of a full-scale meltdown did not appear imminent. Japan's quake was the world's 5th largest on record. And the wall of water that followed was unrelenting and indiscriminate. It took everything in its path. Ships once resting at anchor were tossed into the chaos, including an ocean liner that has yet to be found. Rail cars met the same fate. The whereabouts of their passengers, unknown too.
We're used to earthquakes in Japan. I've experienced many in 5 years, but the first, it just started shaking and something was different. And straight away, me and my co-workers, we looked at each other and we realized this is the big one.
This is what the tsunami looked like from inside the airport at Sendai, where terrified passengers watched and waited. The Japanese Prime Minister got an up-close look at the devastation and the tsunami's raw power, best gauged by the amount of real estate it swallowed. Take this port town near the epicenter. Once a bustling, modern city, those yellow circles mark key government buildings and hospitals. But this is what it looks like now. A town replaced by a toxic brew of mud, oil, and debris. Here alone, more than half the population, nearly 10,000 people, remains unaccounted for. Fires from ruptured gas and oil lines continue to burn out of control. The painful irony here is that water is everywhere, but at least 1 million homes have gone without any drinking water since the quake struck. Millions don't have any power either, and the roads and bridges needed to get repair crews in place to fix it remain largely unpassable. One barrier after another that rescuers and aid workers have to contend with as the flood of international assistance begins to crawl where it's needed most. Now, there is a late word tonight from Japan's nuclear safety agency that there is now a second emergency at a second reactor, but it's in that same complex. Lester, it seems to be, from what officials are saying, that it's a more problem with the coolant malfunctioning again, and we don't know at this point how or if that's going to affect the evacuations that are already underway there.
Powerful, scary words, radioactivity, meltdown. Lee Cowan, thanks very much. We want to talk more about that. Japanese officials say they've calculated at least 160 people they believe have been exposed to radioactivity. 160,000 people have been evacuated from around 2 nuclear plants, most of those from the one that suffered the explosion. We get more on all this now from NBC's Ann Thompson.
Of all the aftershocks, nothing frightened the world more than this: an explosion at the troubled Fukushima 1 nuclear power plant. The Japanese government had already declared an atomic emergency here yesterday when the cooling systems failed and radiation leaks were detected. Now there was a real fear of a meltdown. Throughout the day, Japanese TV reporters used diagrams and maps to help a nervous nation. The blast occurred at the Unit 1 reactor. It destroyed the exterior building, but Japanese officials say the reactor inside remained intact and blamed the explosion on a buildup of hydrogen. This government official said after the explosion, the radiation leaking from the plant actually decreased, as did the pressure inside the troubled reactor.
I think they're being very cautious with respect to how they implement their emergency plan, being very conservative. And given the conditions there, I think that's wise.
When the earthquake struck, the reactor shut down as it was supposed to. But the quake also cut off the power needed to pump water to cool the reactor's core, and the backup power systems failed. Without water to cool it, the core, where the nuclear energy is created, could overheat and melt down, releasing radioactivity into the environment. Tonight, the Japanese utility took the unusual step of pumping seawater into the reactor to prevent a meltdown.
If you're pumping seawater into a reactor, you've pretty much decided that the consequences of not doing so are exceptionally serious. And I think the evidence seems to be in this case that what they're worried about is significant melting of the core.
More signs of concern. People living within the plant's evacuation zone are scanned for radiation. And the International Atomic Energy Agency says Japan is preparing to give iodine to the evacuees from this plant and a nearby nuclear plant damaged in the quake. Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency rates this event a 4 on an international scale of 1 to 7, far below the best-known nuclear energy disasters Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. At Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island, there was a partial core meltdown, but not a significant release of radiation. Japan now waits to see if its fate is the same. Ann Thompson, NBC News, London.
Joe Cirincione is a nuclear energy expert. Mr. Cirincione, we appreciate you being with us. The problem, as we understand it, this particular reactor is an inability to cool it. They're putting seawater on it right now to try and cool the temperature. If they can't bring that temperature down, what's the worst case?
The worst case is a meltdown, which means that the fuel rods in the reactor heat to such a high temperature that they actually melt together. So you would see the core of the reactor turn into a molten mass that would burn right through the steel reactor vessel and drop into the concrete containment building surrounding that vessel. The very worst case is that the containment building, that concrete box, doesn't hold this radioactive molten mass, and the entire core then spews into the environment, putting radioactivity into the ground, the air, and the water.
Right now, they are classifying this a 4 on a scale of 0 to 7. Apparently, there is a scale to measure the extent of nuclear accidents. Does that sound like a fair characterization that this is not higher on the scale?
It sounded like a fair characterization a few hours ago. I'd say this is easily going to be a 5 very soon, which is the rating we gave 3 Mile Island. And if there is an actual meltdown, this clearly goes into the category of 6, or even the Chernobyl incident, which is a massive meltdown of 7. It depends how many reactors fail. As you noted, they're now telling us there's a second reactor. The latest news is that there's actually a third reactor. So all 3 nuclear reactors that were operating at this Daiichi facility facility. They announced that they've lost the ability to inject coolant into all of them, and they're preparing various emergency measures as we speak for all 3 reactors. This is already, if it stops right now, one of the worst nuclear disasters we've ever seen.
All right, Mr. Cincione, thank you so much for your expertise. It was good having you on. I want to talk now more about the area hardest hit by all this. It's a community called Sendai. It's on the northeast coast. It's the largest city in the path of the tsunami. Angus Walker from our partner ITN is there, and here's what he saw.
What the earthquake spared, floods and fire have destroyed. Smoke hangs over Sendai, the city closest to the epicenter, a coastal community where people are now trying to escape the power of this sea. Darkness has now fallen in Sendai, and for a second night running, millions of people are without power. It's pitch black. Have a look at this front door. We're just a few minutes away from the coast, and the watermark shows you how high the flood was. And look at this, the force of the tsunami almost took this front door off its hinges. Inside a shattered family home, on the walls, smiling family photos and a calendar. It was a day Japan will never ever forget.
We've got Angus Walker on the phone now from Sendai. Angus, the sun has been up a couple of hours. What have you seen this morning?
Well, although the center of Sendai, which is a city for around 1 million people, is largely unaffected structurally, there are massive queues for food at supermarkets. Most petrol stations, most gas stations are closed. There are lines of cars waiting at those gas stations that are still selling fuel. So everyone in this region of Japan is affected, even if they manage to escape the damage. What we're trying to do at the moment is get out of the city to head north, and there are queues on the roads, lots of heavy traffic of people trying to get away. 250,000 people are now in temporary housing. 170,000 people have been evacuated from those exclusion zones around the nuclear reactor that you were just discussing.
And in terms of the area, how big an area is being affected by that, and is it hampering the rescuers from getting in?
Rescuers are able to get in by helicopter. We arrived at an airport yesterday south of here, and there was very busy helicopter traffic there. We've seen a number of military helicopters in the air. I went to the crisis center, City Hall, in the center of Sendai, and saw lines of military jeeps lined up. We saw Red Cross units, but it was the size of the City Hall in a small town. Difficult to see how a building of that size, and from the number of people I saw, to see how they would be able to cope with a disaster on this scale.
All right. Angus Walker in Sendai for us. Thank you for your coverage from there. As you noted, the military, the Japanese military, is bringing relief supplies. But this is truly an international effort with a huge contingent of Americans now adding to the rescue efforts. We get more on that from NBC's Miguel Almaguer.
At U.S. military facilities in Japan, relief efforts are underway. 1,500 pounds of rice and bread loaded onto Seahawk helicopters. The desperately needed food airlifted to cities crippled by the quake. Out at sea, the USS Blue Ridge is on the way. Loaded with supplies, the carrier left Singapore Friday.
We're over here to help protect the Japanese people.
With Japan in a state of emergency, more help is coming from around the world. Search and rescue teams from 45 countries are ready to respond. South Korea, Australia, and the United Kingdom have all deployed search teams. Time is working against them.
We know there are miraculous survivors, many days after an incident like this, but we do know that the longer time goes on, the less likely it is we'll find survivors.
In Fairfax, Virginia, crews loaded supplies. Tomorrow, they'll join a team from Los Angeles in Japan.
Okay, hon, you're out of here.
It was that same crew from LA that pulled a Haitian woman from the rubble in Port-au-Prince 6 days after the devastating earthquake there. Her story of survival inspired a country. The team will be looking for another miracle This time in Japan, where some 10,000 may still be missing.
To me, it's the right thing to do as a United States citizen, as a member of the international search and rescue community.
Just back from New Zealand, the Los Angeles team worked side by side with a rescue crew from Japan. Now the Japanese team is headed home to a disaster that hits home like nothing they've seen before. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News, San Jose, California.
For more on the relief effort and how you can help, we've posted some information on our website. You can go there. It's nightly.msnbc.com. When NBC Nightly News continues here from Tokyo on a Saturday night, a question of readiness, what we are learning about the power of the tsunami.
The water's coming down. Now they got it.
Kathy Lee and Hoda. Can we really laugh too much? Dish too much? Have too much fun? Kathy Lee and Hoda, never too much. Weekdays on Today on NBC.
If there is one shred of good news in the disaster here in Japan, it's the thought that this could have been much worse. This is a country that spends an awful lot of time and effort preparing for disasters with constant drills and disaster exercises. And it's likely those drills save thousands of lives. We get more on that now from NBC's Kate Snow.
Japan invented the word tsunami. It literally means harbor wave. Tsunamis and earthquakes are not a rare occurrence here, and after the Kobe quake in 1995, the country went to great lengths to upgrade its building codes. In Tokyo, you could see buildings, skyscrapers swaying.
Yeah.
Is that good?
That's good, yes, because they're absorbing the energy from the earthquake.
They're built to sway.
They're built this way, yeah. Some of them have like big, giant counterweights at the top that move when the building moves, so that when the building moves in one direction, it can move into another direction.
You hear sirens. You hear it sounds like tsunami warnings.
Yeah, it's like a tornado warning that we have here, and that's great because Japan has, like, again, they've developed not only the better building codes, not only the earthquake preparedness, but they have the warning systems. They have the buoys that actually alert them to the fact that we're going to have a tsunami.
There are flood walls in place on many parts of the coast. Evacuation drills teach people what to do when they see water coming. There are actually people up there.
Yeah, they're doing the right thing. They're up on a ridge, they're up on high ground, they're watching what's going on down below. They're smart.
They got out, they probably heard the warning.
That's right, they probably did. So they did what they needed to do.
But no amount of planning can prepare a country for something like this. How fast is that water moving?
Well, that can be doing 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour at least.
So if you're on the ground, we're looking at it from way above.
No, that's moving. It's moving. You're gonna not only look at it, you're gonna see it moving at you, rolling at you. You're gonna hear it. It's a huge roar. So it's very terrifying. The debris can pulverize you.
And the debris is cars.
Right. The current can snatch you. The current can rip things apart. Even a small amount of water, I mean, something that 3 or 4 inches deep can sweep a car.
And there are people down there. Look closely, and you can almost see the panic as it unfolds.
Like, see, and then he's going to get caught. And then there's
up in the right-hand part of your screen.
Car, and then see how the water's coming down? They got caught.
It is difficult to watch, but it is also worth remembering that this is a developed nation. This is not Haiti with its shoddy construction. With such advanced building codes and so much awareness of the dangers of earthquakes and tsunamis, the hope at this hour is clearly that many thousands of people, Lester, were able to get to higher ground.
Kate Snow for us in New York, and Kate is going to be back in just a moment with some of the other news headlines of this day, including a horrific bus crash in New York that's left more than a dozen people dead tonight. We'll be back.
When events shake our nation.
Is this a wake-up call in terms of thinking about security?
And transform our world.
You said that the Egyptian government was stable.
More people turn to the #1 Sunday public affairs show.
If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Back in New York now with some other news of the day. There are new questions tonight about a horrific bus crash early this morning in New York City. A tour bus returning to New York's Chinatown from a casino in Connecticut hit a signpost, was sliced in two, and overturned. 14 people are confirmed dead. Everyone else on the bus was hurt, 7 of them critically. The driver told police he lost control trying to avoid a truck swerving toward him, but tonight, law enforcement sources say passengers reported feeling the bus sway swerving before the crash, and they are looking into whether the driver was distracted or fell asleep at the wheel. Up and down the East Coast, major flooding after heavy rainstorms has forced hundreds of people from their homes. Some parts of Paterson, New Jersey are underwater after the Passaic River spilled over its banks. Bridges connecting two parts of Paterson have now been shut down, and the mayor is threatening to forcibly remove anyone who won't evacuate voluntarily. And it is now official. The standoff between National Football League owners and players has resulted in a player lockout. Negotiations broke off yesterday, hours before the current contract expired. And a reminder before you go to bed tonight, turn your clocks ahead 1 hour. Daylight saving time begins at 2 a.m. for most of the country. Yes, that means an hour less sleep tonight, but also a welcome extra hour of sunlight tomorrow. Lester has more from Japan right after this.
Who's making tomorrow's history today? The extraordinary men and women of the Griots 100, living their dreams and changing our world. Their stories this month on the platforms of NBC News and thegriot.com.
We're back now in Tokyo. People around the world have been glued in front of their TVs and computers looking at those video clips of when the ground here shook and the water surged ashore along this country's east coast. Some of the pictures have been horrendous, others inspiring. And here now, a look at some of the sights and images in Japan. In the hardest hit corner of Japan, survival. In the middle of so much destruction and loss, hope. A group of kindergartners rescued, stranded aboard a boat, now back on land. Treating their injuries on the spot. Today, growing worries about those who hadn't been found. Lists of evacuees were posted at local shelters.
My husband hasn't come here yet. He left home a little later than me. Our house was swept away.
On the roof of one hospital, the staff used towels and sheets to spell out a simple, desperate plea. 300 people, help. And elsewhere, a young woman says she's glad to be alive.
We are all right. I'm relieved that my baby was not harmed.
And that's NBC Nightly News for this Saturday night. I'm Lester Holt reporting from Tokyo, Japan. I'll see you back here tomorrow on Today. Thanks for watching, everyone, and good night.